بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. وخبر الآحاد بنقل عدل تام الضبط متصل السند غير معلل ولا شاذ هو الصحيح لذاته. وهذا أول تقسيم المقبول إلى 4 أنواع، لأنه إما أن يشتمل من صفات القبول على أعلاها أو لا. الأول الصحيح لذاته، والثاني إن وجد ما يجبر ذلك القصور ككثرة الطرق فهو صحيح أيضا لكن لا لذاته، وحيث لا جبران فهو الحسن لذاته، وإن قامت قرينة ترجح جانب قبول ما يتوقف فيه فهو الحسن أيضا لا لذاته. وقدم الكلام على الصحيح لذاته لعلو رتبته. والمراد بالعدل من له ملكة تحمله على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة. والمراد بالتقوى اجتناب الأعمال السيئة من شرك أو فسق أو بدعة. After discussing about the quantity in the sanad, the author now discusses about the quality of the sanad. So thus far he explained how many narrators are needed in each link, that if there are unlimited chains and a person instantly becomes convinced, then the narration is mutawatir. And if there is a minimum of 3 narrators in every link but a person does not get conviction, then the narration will be mashhur. And if the least amount of narrators in any link of the chain is 2, then the narration will be aziz. And if there is only 1 narrator in a particular link, then the narration will be gharib. So all this was regarding the amount of narrators. It was about quantity. He now moves on to discuss about quality, the level of acceptance of the narration. So a few pages back, the author mentioned that ahad are divided into 2 types, into maqbul and into mardud. So the author is now elucidating upon the first category. And in this paragraph ahead, he states that there are 4 types of maqbul narrations: sahih li dhati, and then sahih li ghayri, hasan li dhati, and hasan li ghayri. So he says, وخبر الآحاد بنقل عدل تام الضبط متصل السند غير معلل ولا شاذ هو الصحيح لذاته. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is defining Sahih لذاته as a narration that possesses 5 qualities. And he will give a more elaborate definition to each of these conditions. So for now we'll just mention briefly. The first is, he says, that a khabrul ahad, which is transmitted by an adl, by a person who is upright. Tamil dabti, someone who is very accurate. He's like absolutely, he has complete accuracy. So this means that he possesses a perfect memory. And then the third condition is muttasil as-sanadi, that the chain of transmission is continuous. There are no missing links. غير معلل, that the narration does not have any hidden defects. ولا شاذ, and the narration does not contradict stronger narrations. هو الصحيح لذاته, then this narration is الصحيح لذاته. So looking at these 5 conditions, you could either say that there are 3 conditions which are ijabi, and there are 2 conditions that are salbi. So what does this mean? 3 conditions stipulate what must be found, and 2 conditions stipulate what must be absent. So the 3 conditions that are ijabi, that must be there, are that the narrator must be upright, the narrator must possess accuracy, he must possess a perfect memory, and the chain of transmission must be continuous. So these are 3 conditions that are ijabi, they must be found. And then what are the 2 things that should not be there? Those are that there should be no contradiction with stronger narrators. It should not be shadh, and it should not be mu'allal. There should be no hidden defects. So you can see that these are two things which should be absent, that there mustn't be a contradiction and there mustn't be any hidden defects. So this is one way of viewing it. The other way of looking at it is that two conditions deal with the narrator. That the narrator must have adala and the narrator must have a perfect memory. And then three conditions are concerning the chain, that the chain must be fully connected, and when you say that it should not have any hidden defects, then generally the hidden defects are in the chain. Wala shadh, so the contradiction comes about because of the narrators in the chain. So it also to do with the chain. So this here is the condition that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah presented for an authentic narration. Now an objection comes about here concerning this definition, because Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, instead of saying adlin and tami dhabti, he could have simply said binaqli thiqatin, because the word thiqa combines adala and dhabt. So he did not have to use two words when he could have sufficed with using only one word. And you know the principle, at-ta'arif tusanu anil ishab wal itnab, that when you're giving a definition, then it should be concise. You should not become too elaborate. You should not use any unnecessary words. So it should be precise and to the point. It should be jami' and mani'. That it should be comprehensive, mani', and it should also exclude those things which do not form part of the definition. So in response to this objection leveled against Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, his very loyal student Allama Sakhawi rahimahullah, he says, وكذا أيده غيره بأنهم قد يطلقون الوصف بالثقة على من كان مقبولا ولو لم يكن ضابطا. So he mentions this in Fath al-Mughith in volume 1 on page 368. So that he's mentioning that people, they would use the word thiqa for a person who's honest, a person who's reliable, وَلَوْ لَمْ يَكُنْ ضَابِطًا, even though he might not be very accurate. So therefore it was fine, and it was actually better for the author to mention both of these words separately, because the word thiqa does not necessitate that the narrator will have an absolutely perfect memory and that he was accurate. Allama al-Laqani rahimahullah, he also responds to this objection in Qada al-Watr in volume 2 on page 663. He says, وَيُدْفَعُ بِأَنَّ وَصْفَ الْعَدَالَةِ أَهَمُّ مَا يُعْتَبَرُ فِي النَّاقِلِ فَلَمْ يَكْتَفِ بِالْكِنَايَةِ عَنْهُ. That this objection is averted by the fact that the condition of adala is the most important and it's the most crucial condition for a narrator, and therefore the author had to emphatically mention it. فَلَمْ يَكْتَفِ بِالْكِنَايَةِ عَنْهُ. He didn't just use a word which denotes upon it, rather he very clearly mentioned it. Now Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is mentioning this definition. So whilst we are doing the previous chapters, we mentioned that how for so many of the previous definitions, either they were innovated by Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, or he refined the definitions. So for example, Mashhur, he refined it and said that now we will stipulate it to 3 narrators. Aziz, he said now we will stipulate it and restrict it to 2 narrators, and we explained how Ibn Manda rahimahullah, they mentioned for Aziz 2 or 3, and then Fardul Mutlaq and Fardul Nisbi, how Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he invented the meanings. So the question comes about that would the same apply for this definition of Sahih? That is this a definition that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is making up, or does he attain this definition from others? So what's the basis of this definition? When we look at the books before Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, we find that Allama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he presented the same definition for a Sahih Hadith. So he explained a Sahih narration is al-Hadith al-Musnad alladhi yattasilu isnaduhu. So you can see this here, it's meaning that the sanad should be completely and fully linked. بنقل العدل, exactly the same words. الضابط, عن العدل الضابط إلى منتهاه ولا يكون شاذا ولا معللا. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he obtained this definition from Alama ibn Salah rahimahullah. And when we are doing the lessons of Muqaddama ibn Salah, then we explain how Alama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he derived this definition from the introduction of Sahih Muslim. Deriving means Imam Muslim rahimahullah did not clearly mention it. He studied it and then he deduced it. He took it from there. This was his analysis. This is what he found, and this is what he derived from that, from what Imam Muslim rahimahullah mentioned. Now, after Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah presented this definition, then most scholars started to define Sahih with these 5 conditions. Because you remember how it was said in the beginning that scholars who came after Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, they relied on his book. So in that introduction we discussed his statement, وَلِهَذَا عَكَفَ النَّاسُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَارُوا بِسَيْرِهِ فَلَا يُحْصَى كَمْ نَاظِمٍ لَهُ وَمُخْتَصِرٍ وَمُسْتَدْرِكٍ عَلَيْهِ وَمُقْتَصِرٍ وَمُعَارِضٍ لَهُ وَمُنْتَصِرٍ. So Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he had a lot of influence. So scholars then started to all mention this here as the definition for Sahih. So take Imam Nawawi rahimahullah for example. He defined Sahih as, he said, هو ما اتصل سنده بالعدول الضابطين من غير شذوذ ولا إلا. Like that, scholars all then started to mention these 5 conditions. Now, since this definition became so popular after Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he also defined Sahih in this way. But what about scholars before Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah? Because I just said that Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he derived this definition from Imam Muslim rahimahullah. So that would mean that Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he is the first person to officially define Sahih in this way. So prior to Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, scholars defined Sahih differently. Ulama Khattabi rahimahullah, right at the beginning of Ma'alim al-Sunan, he defined Sahih as فَالصَّحِيحُ عِنْدَهُمْ مَتَّصَلَ سَنَدُهُ وَعُدِّلَتْ نَقَلَتُهُ. That's all that he mentioned for the definition of Sahih. That there should be ittisal in the sanad and the narrator should be adil. So he does not mention anything about al-dabt. He did not mention it that it should not be contradictory, it should not be shadh, and there should be no hidden defects, that it should not be mu'allal. So when we are discussing about Aziz, then there also we mentioned another definition, and that was of Imam Hakim rahimahullah. So he explained a Sahih Hadith as وصفة الحديث الصحيح أن يرويه عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صحابي زائل عن اسم الجهالة. And we explained this exact text, what he means here. وهو أن يروي عنه تابعيان عدلان. That in general you should have 2 students. ثم يتداوله أهل الحديث بالقبول. And then there should be shuhra for the narration, that everyone accepts that narration. إلى وقتنا هذا. So you can see these are 2 scholars who presented these definitions for a Sahih narration. Now some scholars, they try to interpret the definitions that existed before Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, because they wanted to combine all of these prior definitions. So they claimed that no, Ulama Khattabi rahimahullah, he is just presenting a more concise definition, but it encapsulates everything that Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah mentioned. Meaning then that it would encapsulate, it will cover everything that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah just mentioned here. So take for example Ulama Suyuti rahimahullah. So he first took note of Ulama Iraqi rahimahullah's claim that the definition of Ulama Khattabi rahimahullah does not cover dabt, and it does not cover adamul shudud, and it does not cover adamul illah. So what does it mean? It means that out of the 5 conditions, 3 conditions are missing. So in response to that, Ulama Suyuti rahimahullah, he said, قلت الذي يظهر لي أن ذلك داخل في عبارته. He's saying that for me it's apparent that all of these conditions are included. Why? Because he did not just say adl, he said uddila. So when you're putting it from bab taf'il like this here, now it has a greater meaning. So he said, وَأَنَّ بَيْنَ قَوْلِنَا الْعَدْلِ وَعَدَّلُوهُ. If you're using it from bab taf'il, then there is a difference. فَرْقًا لِأَنَّ الْمُغَفَّلِ, that a person who is very negligent, المستحق للترك, لا يصح أن يقال في حقه عدله أصحاب الحديث. If a person is not deserving of having his narrations accepted, then it cannot be said with regards to him that the muhaddithin have authenticated him. وَإِنْ كَانَ عَدْلًا فِي دِينِهِ. Even though if he could be adl, so therefore this word adl, it's so to say inferior, and therefore they needed to add additional conditions. But because ulama Khattabi rahimahullah, he mentioned it from bab taf'il, he did not need to add those additional conditions. Nevertheless, this here then became the very popular definition for a sahih narration. Ulama Ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, وَهَذَا أَوَّلُ تَقْسِيمِ الْمَقْبُولِ إِلَىٰ أَرْبَعَةِ أَنْوَاعٍ. That he gave this definition, and he's saying that this here is the first division of maqbul into 4 types. Now here he mentions taqsim, so you know how sensitive the Arabic language is. Some scholars say that it would have been better if he rather used the word aqsam rather than taqsim. So Mullah Ali Qari rahimahullah, he explained it, أول أقسام حصلت من تقسيم المقبول. Or you can say that هذا الكلام أول تقسيم المقبول. Now he gives an explanation, and he says لأنه إما يشتمل من صفات القبول على أعلاها أو لا. That there are various stages of acceptance, that either a narration can be very accepted, that everyone would accept it because of the level of those who are narrating it. So those who are narrating it, their memories were so good, they had those photographic memories, and they were also so pious, a very high level of piety. So their narrations will be accepted on the highest level. Then you get those who had a very good memory, but it was not, maybe they needed to repeat something, say 3 or 4 times. So it's still extremely good memory. However, it's not as good as those who just needed to hear something once and it was now firmly embedded within their minds. And they were pious, but they were not as pious. So it's still an authentic narration, but it's going to be of a lower stage. Then you get those who maybe they have good memories, but they would have to repeat something 10 times. Likewise, they are not so pious. Then you get those whose memories are slightly weaker. So basically, there are different stages in accepting a narration. So he says, Al-awwalu as-sahih li-dhati, that the first is as-sahih li-dhati. This here is the highest stage. That the highest stage is when a narration is as-sahih li-dhati. And then he touches on the remaining categories of maqbul. But since he is going to discuss each of these categories in detail, so for now we'll just suffice with a brief translation, and we will elaborate when we reach those categories. So he says, وَالثَّانِي إِن وُجِدَ مَا يَجْبُرُ ذَلِكَ الْقُصُورِ كَكَثْرَةِ الطُّرُقِ. That the second is, you find something which will patch up that deficiency, which will make up for that deficiency. كَكَثْرَةِ الطُّرُقِ. So for example, the person did not have the best of memories. However, there is support for him. There's another person who's also narrating it. فَهُوَ الصَّحِيحُ أَيْضًا. So now it will also be sahih. But لكن لا لذاته. It's not going to be sahih لذاته. Rather, it's going to be sahih لغيره. So for now, you can just remember that you have multiple narrators who have weak memories who are quoting the same narration, so that becomes sahih لغيره. وحيث لا جبران فهو الحسن لذاته. If there is nothing to patch up, there is nothing to make up for his weak memory, then because his memory is slightly good and he is a honest person, so then we will grade his narrations as حسن لذاته. وإن قامت قرينة ترجح جانب قبول ما يتوقف فيه فهو الحسن أيضا لا لذاته. That if there is some external factor which makes us now confident to accept what we were hesitant to accept, then it will be Hasan, but it will not be Hasan لذاته, rather it will be Hasan لغيره. And so one of the reasons here also for dividing it in this way is that at times Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he explains this here, he explained it on another occasion, that when there are narrations which seemingly contradict each other, then you can choose that narration which is more authentic. So you have a narration which is Hasan, like you can see that maybe the narrator has a slightly defective memory and he is contradicting someone who has a very, very good memory. So now that narration is Hasan, this narration is Sahih li dhati, so you give preference to the Sahih li dhati. Like I said, that's the explanation that Allama ibn Hajar rahimahullah gave on another occasion. However, in Al-Far'ul Ḥadīth on page 76, it's mentioned there, لكن قد جزم زين قاسم بأنهم لم يراعوا في ترجيحاتهم هذا الاعتبار. That Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubgha, he mentioned that they don't take this into consideration when giving preference to one narration over another narration. So later on in the kitab, inshallah, we'll go into more detail how to do tarjih, how to give preference to one narration over the other. So we'll explain it in more detail there, inshallah. But for now, just know that it's not just because one narration is sahih and the other is hasan, so therefore we're going to give preference to the narration that is sahih. Rather, we will look at other factors and we will mention about those other factors. Nevertheless, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he explains why he commends the discussion with Sahih لذاته وقدم الكلام على الصحيح لذاته لعلو رتبته, because of its greatness, it's of the highest caliber. So therefore, he comments with this here. Now Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah dissects each word of the definition that he presented for Sahih lidhati. So he mentioned adl, he mentioned tam al-dhabt, he mentioned muttasil al-sanad, ghair mu'allal wala shadh. He's going to explain each word separately. So he mentions wal muradu bil adl man lahu malakatun tahmiluhu ala mulazamati at-taqwa wal muruwwah. That what is adl? It is when a person possesses that aptitude, that inner quality that carries him, tahmiluhu, it carries him to always have taqwa and to always have self-respect, to be a dignified person. So this is what he explains. So we can get a better understanding of this word adl if we first look at its literal meaning. So in Lisan al-Arab Ibn Manzur, he said, عدل, that ما قام في النفوس أنه مستقيم وهو ضد الجور. That what's adl is that in your heart you know that this here is correct, وهو ضد الجور, and it goes, it's in contrast to oppression. And thereafter he mentions وفي أسماء الله تعالى وفي أسماء الله سبحانه al-adl, that one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-adl, وهو الذي لا يميل به الهوى. It's al-adl is that person who is not overtaken by his own desires. فَيَجُورُ فِي الْحُكْمِ, and because of that he then oppresses. And then he says also وَالْعَدْلُ الْحَكَمُ بِالْحَقِّ, that when a judge has to pass a verdict and a judgment with accuracy, then you will also use the word adl. وَالْعَدْلُ مِنَ النَّاسِ الْمَرْضِيُّ قَوْلُهُ وَحُكْمُهُ. So you can see this is the meaning of al-adl, someone who is straight. Allama Bazdawi rahimahullah, he explains the literal meaning as something that is extremely straight in his usul on page 166. وَأَمَّا الْعَدَالَ فَإِنَّ تَفْصِيرَهَا الْإِسْتِقَامَةِ يُقَالُ طَرِيقُ عَدْلٍ لِلْجَادَةِ وَجَائِرٍ لِلْبُنَيَّاتِ. That you all can say that this word here is this road is adl. That means it's a straight road, and if there's bends and curves and turns, then you will use the word jada. You will use the word jair. Sorry. And then Allama Zarkashi rahimahullah in Al-Bahr al-Muhit fi Usul al-Fiqh, volume 3, page 332, he also mentioned there والعدل والعادل توسعا مأخوذ من الاعتدال وفي الاصطلاح. Now this is the point here. Look, he's mentioned وفي الاصطلاح, that the word adl, it has an istilahi meaning. So you can see that one is if you're looking at it from the literal meaning. And Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he is now himself explaining what he meant when he used the term here. So he says مَلَّهُ مَلَكَةٌ تحمله على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة. That it is that person who has that aptitude and that inner force that carries him in maintaining taqwa and having self-dignity. So these are the words that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah used, but these words are not his own words. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he obtained this definition from earlier usuliyin and from the previous fuqaha of his madhab. For example, if you look, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, in Al-Mustasfa on page 125, he defined uprightness, adala, as, he said, وَالْعَدَالَ عِبَارَةٌ عَنْ إِسْتِقَامِ السِّيرَ وَالدِّينِ ويرجع حاصلها إلى هيئة راسخة في النفس تحمل على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة جميعا. Can you see? So it's mentioned تحمل على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة جميعا حتى تحصل ثقة النفس بصدقه. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah took these words from Imam Ghazali rahimahullah. Likewise, Alama Fakhruddin al-Razi in Al-Mahsul in volume 4 on page 571, he mentioned al-adala wa hiya hay'atun rasikhatun fi an-nafs تحمل على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة جميعا حتى تحصل ثقة النفس بصدقه ويعتبر فيها الاجتناب عن الكبائر وعن بعض الصغائر إلى آخره. But the words which I wanted to show you, he clearly used the words تحمل على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة جميعا, and those are the same words that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is using here. Likewise, Alama Amidi rahimahullah in Al-Ihkam volume 2 page 88, وحاصلها يرجع إلى هيئة راسخة في النفس تحمل على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة جميعا. So many Shafi of the scholars, they explained it with these two words, taqwa and muru'ah. And Alama Munawi rahimahullah, he refers to a Hanafi scholar who used the same words to define adala. He says, وَأَمَّا تَعْبِيرُ الْمُصَنِّفِ بِمَا ذَكَرَهُ فَقَدْ تَبِعَ فِيهِ صَاحِبَ الْبَدِيعِ. He's mentioning that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is following the author of Badi'. So here when he mentions the word Badi', then he's referring to Badi'un Nizam, and the author was Ibn Sa'ati. So he mentioned that Ibn Sa'ati, he said that al-adala hay'atun tahmilu ala mulazamati taqwa wal muru'ah. So how we know that he is definitely referring to Ibn Sa'ati is because you can see Ibn Hajar rahimahullah used the word malakatun, and Ibn Sa'ati, he used this word hay'atun. So he definitely, when he's quoting, when he mentions your Sahib al-Badi', and it refers to Badi'un Nizam, because there is where you will find these exact words. So that shows that there were many scholars who used these terms when explaining adala. And like that, you will get many other Hanafi scholars also using these terms, like Alama Babarti rahimahullah and Alama ibn Humam rahimahullah. So they also use these exact words to define adala. And this here also reminds me of another point. You know, we mentioned in the beginning that some scholars, they claim that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he should have rather used the word thiqah. So we explained that it was better for him to use the word adala because of the importance of adala, and because the word thiqah, it does not fully incorporate the meaning of dabd. But Sheikh Awama, he says that you still need to explain the word adala after that. So rather than mentioning the word thiqah, then explaining that it means adala, and then explaining adala, we rather just explain adala from the very beginning. And here you can also see that, and that is why when you are quoting from Allama Zarkashi rahmallah, I told you take note that he's calling it an istilah, because it's not, we're not just taking the literal meaning of adala, that a person is honest, rather it has this istilahi meaning. And that istilahi meaning is that it has to fulfill these two conditions, that a person should have taqwa and a person should have muru'ah. And therefore Mullah Ali Qari rahimahullah, he also clarifies that when you use the word adala in the science, then it does not have the same meaning as when you are using it for shahada. So he says, وَالْمُرَادُ عَدْلُ الرِّوَايَةِ لَا عَدْلُ الشَّهَادَةِ فَلَا يُخْتَصُ بِالذَّكَرِ. That if you open the books of fiqh, and you see them speaking about the necessity of a person being adil, then that is different. They put the condition that there has to be 2 males or 1 male and 2 females. And then there is the difference on whether a person is free or whether a person is a slave. Alama Abu Bakr Jassas, he says in Al-Fusul fil Usul, volume 3, page 138, وَالذَّكَرْ وَالْأُنْثَى وَالْحُرْ وَالْعَبْدِ وَالْبَصَرْ وَالْأَعْمَى فِي ذَلِكَ سَوَاء. That all those apply to, in Shahada there will be a distinction. But when it comes to riwayah, then it doesn't make any difference at all. A female can also narrate a hadith. Aisha radiallahu anha, so many narrations. A slave can also transmit. It also doesn't make a difference whether a person is blind or whether a person can see. Many of the very senior muhaddithin were blind. لأن الصحابة لم تفرق في قبولها أخبار الآحاد بين شيء من ذلك، بل كانوا يسألون نساء النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الأحكام التي تخصهن، هل عندهن عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم منها شيء، فقبلوا ما يوردونه عليهم من ذلك، وكانوا يقبلون من روايات من كف بصره، منهم ابن عباس وجابر وواثلة بن الأسقع وإبان بن مالك في نظائرهم من الصحابة. So in short, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he explained adala with 2 terms, at-taqwa and al-muru'ah. Now he's going to explain these 2 terms. Inshallah, we will explain this in the next lesson. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.